Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Mast, and unlike last time's alpha playtest review, this video is going to get a lot deeper into some general concepts that I would like to see in Smite 2, and that I think Hi-Rez is currently missing out on with basically big sweeping changes they could make to make Smite 1 better going into Smite 2. So we will still talk about the alpha playtest. We're going to start with that. I'm going to go over basic thoughts, things that should change, things that are good, things that are new, and then we'll move on to things that I would like to see changed in the near future that are pretty easy to do, kind of just big balance changes that should happen, and then also much bigger balance changes that I simply don't expect to happen, but absolutely should and would make Smite significantly better, and would make Smite have a much better chance at being the large-scale game MOBA competitor that Hi-Rez has wanted it to be, and I think has basically given up on it being. So, let's start with the simple stuff. What's new and general thoughts? I got this kind of scripted. I don't know how much I'm going to go off of script. Eventually, we're going to have stuff that's less scripted, but I have written down a ton of things, so it's going to be somewhat scripted, even though it might not sound like that, because I tend to write the way that I talk. So right now the game is generally feeling a decent amount smoother than it did in the last playtest, but it does still have stuttering issues and it has occasional server issues that definitely do stand out, and there's overall more latency compared to Smite 1 even without those stutters and even without those server issues, but there is less than there was in the last playtest. So it's getting better, it's getting closer, there's still a notable difference, but there is less of a notable difference. If I had to guesstimate, I would say it feels at least 15 to 20% better, and for 1 month, I think that's really good. So it is starting to feel better. There is something that in a way makes it feel laggier that some of you might have noticed whether you changed it or not. If you change your sensitivity in the game, it's bugged at the moment so that it'll reset. Maybe it's not a bug, maybe for some reason it's a weird feature, obviously wouldn't last on launch, where your sensitivity gets reset to default at 25, and then I have to up it every time to 35. Sometimes I forget. That's a crazy difference. Kind of makes it feel laggy when your sense is just lower than it should be, right? So you might have that too. Might make it feel worse, but that's just a bug. One big thing to note, I didn't have any invisible abilities in this playtest, which is something I specifically talked about being really bad in the last playtest. Invisible abilities that I had were at the very least Anubis wrap and Kukulkan one. I didn't test Kukulkan, I specifically made sure to test Anubis every time I cast the ability in the game. The wrap was not invisible, so please let me know if you had invisible abilities. Definitely make sure to leave comments down below, and I do mean in this playtest, and let me know that that's still a thing for you, if it's still a thing for you, because I seem to think that it's fixed, but I could just not know, and for other people it's still a problem. It seems to be based on ping. The amount of rage quits and people playing the wrong roles is still a massive problem in Smite 2. Anybody watching my videos definitely got to see that towards the end of the videos. I got very lucky on day 1 of the playtest and it felt completely fine, but after that it went downhill very fast, and on the bright side it was still somewhat better than the last playtest, but not by very much. I would guess that this time at least 60% of my games were ruined by a rage quit, which normally at least meant an early surrender, which makes it a little bit better. But there were also games where we had F7 Warriors. I had people F7 Warrior a 4v3 game to at least 35 minutes. Not a good time. Both of the 2 new gods that they added I think feel really good to play already, but only Hades actually became more interesting as a character, or at least significantly more interesting as a character. I really enjoyed his rework as it is, but I think Soul is pretty much the same Soul that she was in Smite 1. The biggest change that they made to Soul was to increase the size of her 1 based on the level of her heat, which is cool, but it's not going to matter very much. It's fun to be able to build her with strength and with crit items, but that's not really a Soul feature, it's just a new Smite 2 feature. So Hi-Rez should definitely do more to change up Soul's kit and her playstyle, and I think the best way to do that would be by a significant rework to her 3, which is a pretty boring ability. The new items are fun. Anyone who watched my videos from this playtest should know that I've had a lot of fun messing with the new Mirrodin and Pendulum Blade items. The new Typhon's Fang is a cool concept as well, even though we didn't get to see that in the video. In Smite 2, Typhon's is fully dedicated to lifesteal, and it grants 40% lifesteal and 150 mana for an entire tier 3 item. So it's lacking in damage, but you get rewarded with insane lifesteal, which I think is a really cool concept, and it's very easy to balance because you don't have to tune down the power, you only have to tune down the lifesteal. Most items are still using recolored Smite 1 art as placeholders, which is fine, but the items that have gotten new art look really good so far. Helm of Darkness is a perfect example, it looks absolutely badass. I think almost every god had at least one skin available to use in this playtest, and everyone that I used looked good and felt good. You can report players in your match from the scoreboard during or after the game by clicking on their name. I don't know what penalties people will be receiving, but hopefully this will help punish rage quitters and anybody blatantly trolling in games now and in the future. You might remember that near the end of my last Alpha Notes video, I ranted about there being no ward skin yet, and Hi-Rez did add a ward skin and a map indicator for the vision radius of wards. I don't know if I caused it, but thank you, Hi-Rez. So in summary, I do think that the game is getting better already. Just like I said in the last Notes video, I do think that Smite 2 will become better than Smite 1. However, just like that last video, I still don't think it feels as good to play as Smite 1, and I think it'll at least be a few months until it does. I've brought up in a couple of the recent Smite 2 videos that I'm going to be more critical this time around, and after writing down a ton of notes over the course of this playtest, I really do have a huge chunk of feedback. In fact, I have so much feedback that we're not going to get to all of it in this video, even though this video is going to get very in-depth and get decently long going over a large chunk of that. So let's talk about the things that need to change, and I'm going to separate this into two categories: easy to implement changes and hard to implement changes. The easy ones are mostly quality of life changes, while the hard ones will be huge game-shifting changes like cutting the duration of crowd controls in half, which I don't expect Hi-Rez to do, but I think they absolutely should. Let's get into it, starting with the easy changes. The item source shaft consumables is the top bar of every single selectable filter. It's so annoying to need to have 0 filters selected in order to see the consumables tab in the store. They take up 1 bar, just show them all the time. Consumables also desperately need their own slots, just like in Smite 1. The fact that you can move active items to the desired slot isn't enough, although it is a good feature to have in the game. Managing your hotkey slots early in the game while you're still buying potions is annoying, and it would just be better to have 2 reliable hotkeys for consumables all the time. On a similar note, wards need to be purchasable. I'm fine with keeping a ward/sentry ward shard like we have right now, but it's definitely not enough overall, and wards will absolutely need consumable slots in order to be viable in the late game, which is when they should also be the most prominent. If each team in a competitive game is limited to 5 sentry wards total every 2 minutes, which is what we get through the shards at the moment, that would be absolutely absurd for late game objectives. And as of now, any consumable wards would limit players to only building 5 out of their 6 items, leaving a slot in order for them to ward. Obviously that would be dumb, which means we need consumable slots. I don't think it's a huge deal, but I have 0 clue why there's no line or ruler targeter in the game right now, just like we have in Smite 1. I can't imagine that it's too difficult to add, and I think it's a pretty important and standard element of aiming in Smite. A pretty small thing is that I think there should be a stat screen at the end of the game, because it's valuable, and it's fun, and it shouldn't be very hard to make. I'm pretty sure that Hi-Rez hasn't added a text chat system yet because they don't want people BMing each other in an alpha, which I think is fair, but I also think it's just gonna happen at some point when the game releases anyways. It's a MOBA. Communication is really bad in the game right now, and I think it would be very helpful to have a chat system, and if you're trying to weed out the toxic, obnoxious problem players, then being able to report them for chat messages, if anything, should speed it up, right? Eventually, they're going to put the chat system in by launch, I'm sure, so why not add it now so that people can actually communicate with each other and be able to more so do what they're trying to do. At the moment, a variety of VGS, like VGG, automatically use the self-equivalent, like VSGG, which right now just interferes with communication for no reason, and I think it should be changed or fixed if it's a bug, back to normal. Smite's VGS in its current state in Smite 1 is basically perfect. It's an incredible system. The only thing they should be doing is adding a few basic helpful ones, and they shouldn't remove any of them. Some mana and or MP5 items are desperately needed at the moment. I've talked about this a lot in some of the recent videos, especially in the solo lane. If Hi-Rez wants to make those less accessible than they are in Smite 1, I think that's completely fine. Smite 1, you can get 1,000 mana off an item, you can get 60 MP5 off an item, and sometimes it's just something you're conveniently getting on the side, and it's not even a big focus of the item. So it totally makes sense to try and nerf that, but we need to at least have them, and the current state of mana items in Smite 2 is almost non-existent. So any build that spams cooldowns is going to run Oom very quickly, and is going to take away a lot of those build paths that should at the moment be available and be fun to mess with. So I'd love to see some more mana items work their way into the game. This is going to be a crazy thing for me to say. I touched on it in a video. Tower damage is too low. Yeah, I just said that. Mast of all people is saying tower damage is too low, and you absolutely should know that that means tower damage is too low. I actually dove into it a little bit, looking back at some of my past videos as well as testing it in Smite 1, and got to see there is a crazy difference in Smite 2 and Smite 1 tower damage at the moment, and Hi-Rez needs to find some middle ground. I don't think that towers should do nearly as much as they do in Smite 1. I've been very vocal about that pretty much as tower changes have occurred over the past few years, but at the moment they do hit insanely weak in Smite 2. For an example, in Smite 2 is Odin at level 3 with no protection items. The first tower shot I took did 124 damage. And then I looked back at a longer dive later in the game with Breastplate finished at level 8, and the tower shot scaled from 90 to 109 to 127 to 145 over 4 shots, and did only 370 damage, which is about 27% of my max HP of 1380. So a 4.5 second tower dive only did a quarter of my HP, which I think is obviously too low, even with a defense item, way too low. So I went ahead and did a similar build in a Smite 1 jungle practice with the same level. I was just 2 protections off, and I took 200 damage, 240 damage, 280 damage, and then 320 damage from tower, doing 75% of my max HP in Smite. So the good thing is that means there's a lot of room, because in this example, Smite 1 towers hit 3 times harder than they do in Smite 2. So of course it should be easy enough for Hi-Rez to find some middle ground here and instead buff Smite 2 towers by about 50% and not be hitting so hard as they do in Smite 1, but still hitting significantly harder than they do in Smite 2. And that does it for the easy changes. Tower changes might sound like a big one. It's actually just simple number changes. It's not very hard, so I thought I'd include it with that. We are moving on to the big changes, the controversial stuff, the hot takes that aren't all that hot, because I think the vast majority of high-level players in Smite would agree with these, especially when we get into the actual numbers of it. So, let's start off with crowd control. This is something that Predecessor has really opened my eyes to. It's something I've known Smite has too much of for a long time. It's something that generally the community in the back of their mind knows Smite has too much of for a long time. But crowd control numbers are huge. Crowd controls often are large AoEs as well. And the state of it is pretty clunky and awkward. And it's something where Predecessor, which has significantly lower crowd control times, those crowd controls in Predecessor still feel incredibly valuable, even though they're effectively less devastating one-on-one. So, let's dive into it. Smite 1's biggest flaw throughout the entirety of the game is the length and inconsistency of crowd control. Many big crowd control abilities last as much as 2 seconds, which is easily enough for you to get 100 to 0 when there's follow-up from teammates. Ideally, fights should rely on multiple events to determine the outcome of that fight, where either multiple successes or multiple failures end up making the difference. Crowd control duration is long enough on many abilities that the mistake of getting hit by 1 CC is often enough to completely lose the fight, not just for you, but for your teammates as well. Crowd control isn't just frustrating for its duration though. DR, which stands for diminishing returns, is also a big factor to the frustration of crowd control in Smite. While long CC durations feel bad for the player on the receiving end, diminishing returns feel bad for the player on the giving end. Diminishing returns is a hidden stacking buff that every player in the game receives for 15 seconds when they've been hit by a hard crowd control. Each stack of DR provides a 20% crowd control reduction buff for 15 seconds, stacking up to 4 times. Most hard crowd controls apply 1 stack of DR, but others apply 2 or more depending on the type and the number of crowd controls applied. For example, max rank Emir Freeze in Smite 2 lasts for 2 seconds. If you get hit by this with no stacks of DR and no beads available to immune it, it'll feel really bad. 2 seconds is a lot of time for enemy gods to hit you for free, but if you had 4 stacks of DR, that Emir Freeze would only last for 20% of the 2 second duration, which is a 0.4 second CC. That is a way smaller window for enemies to work with and an insane nerf to the ability, which feels terrible for the Emir player that froze you. I went ahead and went through Smite 2's current hard CCs, and currently the average Smite 2 hard CC lasts for 1.6 seconds, which is a pretty long time. Now don't get me wrong, this isn't a new thing for Smite 2, Smite 1's hard CC durations are actually longer. For a comparison, I went through the same abilities in Smite 1, and the average for Smite 1 is 1.85 seconds. That means Hi-Rez has already nerfed crowd control on average by 15% in Smite 2, which is a pretty huge nerf and a step in the right direction. However, it doesn't solve Smite's major CC problem, which is that crowd control abilities can CC you for too long or for too little, and it's based entirely on the original CC stats and diminishing returns. And I think the perfect model ability for crowd control already exists in Smite 2. Bacchus Flop applies a 1 second knock-up, and knock-ups are immune to diminishing returns. Abilities like Sobek Pull, Herc Pull, Bacchus Flop, Cocolinal, and so on will always pull you as far as they're supposed to pull you and knock you up as far as you're supposed to be knocked up. They're consistent. And Bacchus Flop received a massive 33% nerf to its knockup duration in Smite 2, going from 1.5 seconds in Smite 1 to just 1 second in Smite 2. And I think this should be the new ideal across the board for Smite 2's hard crowd controls. A 30% nerf on average to crowd control duration, but diminishing returns should also be removed entirely from the game and from all CCs. Combining hard CCs back-to-back would become significantly stronger, CC in general would become more reliable, but also your odds of dying from getting hit by one hard CC would decrease dramatically. Alright, let's move on to another point, and yes, there is more. 9.5 changes need to be reverted, or at the very least, massively nerfed. For anyone who doesn't know or at this point is forgotten, here are the exact major changes from the 9.5 update. Increased base health by 40%, increased base health per level by 5%, increased base physical protection by 40%, increased physical protection per level by 8%, increased base magical protection by 28%, and increased magical protection per level by 28% as well. 9.5 delivered a massive global balance shift to make all gods significantly healthier in the early game, and this extra health also carried over to the late game at a diminishing rate, increasing their level 20 HP by a little over 10%. These changes were essentially unprecedented in Smite history at the time, and they still are to this day, and it's easily one of the biggest game balance updates that Smite has ever received, and I still think most people who were playing at the time will agree that it was overall a bad change to Smite that was never undone. Smite had existed for 9.5 seasons up until that point, with relatively similar base stats, and then from downtown, Hi-Rez essentially made every god about 50% tankier to start the game. And there was a reason for this update, don't get me wrong, but in what later became typical fashion, Hi-Rez decided to globally adjust Smite stats rather than isolating the problematic stats of the OP gods and OP items of the meta at the time. During that point in Smite, bursty warriors, ability-based hunters, and assassins were dominating early game Smite, and it stood out the most in the middle lane, which typically had a 2v2 face-off of the mid lane and the jungle during levels 2 and 3, and often led to at least one kill on one of the sides. The top mid picks of the time included gods like AMC, Chiron, Ullr, Susano, and Set, while the top junglers consisted of bursty warriors as well as a few assassins like Erlang, Shiva, Gilgamesh, Osiris, Nemesis, and Daji. This meta was so weird that at the time Pagon was whipping out Gilgamesh mid lane, and it was actually good. The biggest standout in the meta was Erlang Shen, who between the burst damage and crowd control on both his 2 and his 3 was an absolute menace from level 2 onwards. This led to him being reworked in the 9.4 update to essentially remove his strongest component, which was the knockup on his turtle form of his 3, and this nerf was plenty to push him significantly lower down the jungle tier list. But rather than continuing to hard nerf the other problematic gods of the time, Hi-Rez opted to release the 9.5 update and instead increase base health by such an obscene amount that dying in the first few levels was for the most part a thing of the past. The other changes like HP per level and starting protections were understandable and significantly less impactful than giving everybody 40% more starting HP at level 1. If there is any perfect opportunity to finally undo the negative impact of 9.5, it's in Smite 2, and unfortunately these changes have actually become more prevalent in Smite 2. Although some gods' starting stats have remained similar, other gods like Loki have received another 150 starting HP when compared with Smite 1, and yes, that's after the 200 HP he received from the 9.5 update. Loki's starting health right now is 47 lower than Ymir's, a god specifically known as being one of the tankiest gods in all of Smite. Sol's another example of a huge buff to starting HP, starting with over 100 more HP than she currently has in Smite 1, while the health pools of tankier gods like Hades, Ymir, and Odin typically are remaining about the same. And not only are gods in Smite 2 staying just as tanky or getting tankier, but we also receive lower starting gold and no starter items, which significantly nerfs early game damage from items. I brought up in the Hades video that at level 4, I was doing 39 damage in auto, while I had just over 1k HP, meaning it would take nearly 30 autos in a row for me to die, and that's without any healing. Meanwhile, health potions are stronger than ever, healing for 25 health a tick, which would undo 60% of the damage dealt per auto. It's absolutely insane how hard it is to kill somebody during the first few levels of the game right now, and maybe the best example of this is from early jungle ganks. You can kit dump someone as a level 2 jungler and not even do half of their health bar, which means that a completely successful 1v2 gank where everybody lands everything won't even net you a kill. Smite lasted 9.5 seasons before the 9.5 update with significantly lower starting health, if the health changes from 9.5 as well as the bonus health changes that some gods received in Smite 2 were completely removed right now, the nerf to starting gold would still make people harder to kill at level 1 than they have been for the vast majority of Smite's lifespan, and that would be completely fine. It's absolutely insane to me that it's been nearly 2 years since one of Smite's worst updates of all time, and that Smite 2 right now is only adding on to it. Loki seriously has about 70% more starting HP right now in Smite 2 than he had in Smite 1 just 3 years ago. I don't think anything more needs to be said. That number is crazy, and I'll move on. Alright, so while I was doing research for this video, looking into the 9.5 update, reminding myself of the history of the 9.5 update, I actually went back, found my own 9.5 patch notes review video, and wanted to see what my reaction was to the patch. And believe it or not, Mast on point with the takes, predicted to go about exactly how it did, and that it'd be bad, and that they should make more specific changes. I thought I'd actually showcase a little part of that video to go along with this, so you guys can see how I reacted at the time before I even got to play it. Every single god in Smite will receive the following changes. Okay. Increased base HP by 40%. Increased base HP per level by 5%. Increased base physical protection by 40%. Increased physical protection per level by 8%. Okay. Increased base magic prop by 28%. Increased magic prop per level by 28%. Okay. So basically what this is going to do, obviously everybody gets way tankier, at least unless they're going to make damage changes as well. This is crazy, by the way. This is absolutely wild. Unless they make more changes, this means people don't kill each other at like level 1 or level 2. It's just like not a thing that happens unless you try really, really hard. And they're just like, fuck it, let's fight. So I'm honestly, I like going bold Hi-Rez. I do. I think this looks a little shit for early game fighting, so I'm currently not a fan. I'm not going to lie. But maybe, and I'm okay with this, as long as if it turns out like a little bit shitty, like I think it's going to be. I think fighting levels 1 through 3 is now cringe. A more vocal way, what's the word I'm looking for? A better explanation than just saying cringe because I'm a zoomer is, I think fighting now between level 1 and level 3, because of this massive base HP boost, it's going to have such a longer time to kill on everybody ever that it's mostly just going to be a waste of time, and we should all go our separate ways and farm. And if you guys have played Smite for very long, you know that the most recent history, or the most standout in history moments of Smite, where it went to, hey, let's not fight, let's go farm, because that's meta, was Season 3 and Season 4, which were the worst seasons Smite has ever had. So, I'm a little bit scared by this, but maybe I'm overthinking and it's not as big of a deal, and they're making some big changes, and if they are willing to undo some of these changes and make big reverts so that it's not quite as extreme, I don't give a shit. If they troll the game a little bit for 2 weeks or 4 weeks and then they fix it because they're trying things and they want to make the game better, I don't really care. My opinion. Spoilers, they didn't really revert it at all. They pretty much kept it in. It was bad. They should have found some middle ground. They didn't try to, in typical Hi-Rez fashion. It's something that rewatching, I watched this earlier today, and rewatching it now after I am editing this video, putting it together, after I've written this script, after I've looked into all this stuff, it bothers me to an unbelievable degree because it is sheer incompetence and it's blatant. And it's pretty rare that I'm going to be that hard on Hi-Rez, and I don't really want to be in this video because I know it pisses off a sad amount of the Smite community to dare shit on the game that I love and is overall my favorite game of all time, and that is literally my job. But it is what it is, man. It is absolutely mind-blowing that I had this take immediately as a non-dev. It was dead accurate, and they didn't run it back at all. They buffed base HP at level 1 by 40%. And I went through a bunch of base HP stats now. This is the hypothetical. It's going to be about base HP 40% average. It normally ended up nowadays, it's around like 35% is what I typically found. So basically the same thing. If they just wanted to revert it, they could have gone all the way back to like 15% and it should have mostly felt fine. Of course, it didn't come close. Oh my God, it bothers me so much. All right, just before I do actually move on to the next point, I want to give a little bit more context for a lot of people that I'm now realizing are probably more out of the loop with these changes and wondering just how dead on I actually am about this stuff. Because you guys might be thinking, whether it's in your own games or in games you watch me play, Mast, you kill people early game all the time. But so often the deaths early game now in Smite are due to incompetence on the player that died's part. It's not about outplaying, it's about them screwing up. And it used to be in Smite, while that did happen, there was more awareness of the ability to die early game, and simply nowadays Smite is in a lower population player-based state, which makes it easier for me to clap people. People do just in general regularly screw up because I'm going to tend to be a high-rated player, getting matched with people that might be similarly overall high-rated but still lower-rated than me, and so frequently in videos that you guys see, I might still kill people early game, but when you see a truly competitive game that is well played on both parts, you mostly do not die early game, except to ganks and except in team fights. It mostly should not be happening. It used to happen, and it was actually a good part of the game. It was not perfectly balanced. During that exact meta where they implemented 9.5, it was the worst state it had ever been, where it was crazy how bursty you could get, where the reason they came up with this idea, and I do think this is largely based on the amount of mid lane developers that were then incorporated into Hi-Rez around that time, is that in the middle lane, especially if you were playing a mage, it was shockingly easy to die by the two opponents being the mid lane and the jungle you were going against, bursting you down at level 2 with the two abilities that they had and auto attacks. Physical burst gods that could have high physical auto attack damage and high base damage on the two abilities to maybe 3 abilities they had at the time, could do crazy damage really fast and you could die. And that was dumb. But they didn't need to buff base HP. If they wanted to buff base HP, they should have kept it much smaller, or at the very least gone decently crazy, maybe upped it by 30%, and then like I brought up, nerfed it down to something like 15%. That would be much more acceptable. That might actually be a good change. Doing such a massive crazy change and being like, this is Smite now. Turns out, you look back through history, it didn't need to be Smite. Smite was great, this made it worse. It's not a big surprise. If you're newer to the game, you might not notice that, but it simply made it worse and you just don't know any better. Understand that Smite used to be great as it was, and it didn't need this, okay? So, a little bit more context, again, adding on right here, is that when you fought in the early game before, you had a lot more kill potential in 1v1 situations that no longer is nearly as high. Now in 1v1s, you need to screw up a lot more early game to be dying in that 1v1. It's not that they have the power to kill you, it's that you have the power to screw yourself up and die, is basically how it works now. So, in a truly competitive, more balanced game now, there's less outplaying each other early game when it comes to 1v1s or 2v2s in your lane, like duo lane 2v2ing each other, solo lane 1v1ing each other or whatever. Significantly less kill potential there, and instead you look to pressure wave, farm faster, farm harder, maybe poke, and then go to do farm. Normally you should not at all be killing each other without ganks, which is less fun. Now you can argue that there was too much damage, it was too easy to kill each other, but basically we went from maybe it was a little too much, we should change it a bit, to we're gonna make it so it just shouldn't happen unless there's just a big skill gap, which is way too big of a change and it never got undone. So again, like some other things I have talked about in this video, it would be great if Hi-Rez could find some middle ground. The reason this is so frustrating for me to look back on is this middle ground I expected in the patch notes video that I did. I expected there needed to be middle ground and that they would find it within a month. They have not found it within 2 years. So now I'll actually move on. Alright, the harshest points are out of the way. Let's move on to one of the most common takes, which is that many of the gods already added to Smite 2 should receive a larger rework than they already have. There's not even a ton to talk about here. At some point in the near future, I might make a video with exact ideas for how to rework a few of the gods, but the simple point is that the gods who have received big changes in Smite 2 feel a lot more fun, and the gods that haven't received big changes feel disappointing in comparison. Loki's invis now resets on kills. Hades can jump or use a different ability in his ultimate. Ymir's wall has a knockback / rocket jump for himself on it, but then other gods are basically just the same. Odin is basically just Odin from Smite 1, Fenrir is basically Fenrir from Smite 1, and while those two and many other different gods have received minor tweaks which open up build paths for them, the abilities themselves essentially just remain the same. Hi-Rez has put themselves in a tricky spot here where I'm assuming they themselves realize at this point that a noticeable rework per god would be a great addition, but they also want to release gods frequently enough that they can catch up to the Smite 1 god pool within a few years. Recreating the original Smite 1 kit with new art and new code in a new engine is already a lot of work, and of course expanding on that kit would just be adding a lot more work to an already difficult task and slow down the speed at which they transfer new gods over to Smite 2. However, to me, and I think many other people, the payoff is well worth it because changes like these are what really makes Smite 2 feel like a brand new game and not just Smite 1 on a new engine. Alright, here is my final point for any big changes, at least in this video, and it should be a lot easier to implement than the last few that I've mentioned. Smite 2 is not doing a great job of allowing the hybrid builds that Hi-Rez currently wants to enable. Few abilities in the game actually have hybrid scaling on them, and most of the abilities that do separate the strength and intelligence scaling to different parts of the ability. Right now, looking at the god chart in Smite 2, there are 15 gods, 60 abilities, and 8 of those have both strength and intelligence for the damage scaling. However, 8 of those current 15 have a combination of strength and intelligence scaling abilities. On average, that means each of those gods only has one ability that effectively lets them do both. And because of this, only 2 of those 8 hybrid gods are actually effective at dealing damage while building both strength and intelligence, which are Neith and Chalk. Other than these 2, every single god in the game should be focusing on either strength or intelligence in order to do damage. Obviously, an OP item like Soul Devourer can be an exception here, but temporarily OP items aside, every god other than Neith and Chalk are simply better off building either strength or intelligence, not both at the same time. And to go along with this, every single god in the game at the moment has the same auto attack scaling of 100% strength and 20% intelligence. And because of this, any god who deals the majority of their DPS through autos should be building strength items. Currently, there are 3 hunters in the game with mostly int scaling abilities, which are Neith, Soul, and Cern. Neith is more ability based, so an intelligence build works fine for her, but intelligence scaling massively punishes Soul and Cern because they're both heavily reliant on their auto attack damage, which will be extremely low with an intelligence build. There are a few intelligence items that do increase auto attack damage to help remedy this, but it's nowhere near enough to solve the problem. They are still heavily outclassed by their physical counterparts. If Hi-Rez truly wants to open up itemization, then they need to reassess the scaling on both abilities and on auto attacks to more frequently allow a combination of both strength and intelligence items. At the moment, there are very few items that have both strength and intelligence stats on them, and those that do aren't particularly high damage. So with that in mind, it would be very easy to increase the intelligence scaling on auto attacks for characters like Neith, Soul, and Cern in order to make those intelligence builds more viable. For example, Soul and Cern could have 100% strength and a 40% intelligence auto attack scaling, while a more ability focused character like Neith could have 100% strength and just 30 intelligence auto attack scaling. Meanwhile, abilities like Bacchus Flop and Anubis Wrap, which randomly integrate strength into an otherwise intelligent scaling god, and vice versa, should be changed to scale off of intelligence, and if Hi-Rez is afraid of the ability hitting too hard with intelligence scaling, then they can simply lower that scaling. While it makes sense thematically to have an ability like Bacchus Flop scale off of strength, at the moment it's only hindering him when both his belch and his ultimate scale off of intelligence. If they want Bacchus to actually have hybrid scaling, then they need to implement it into every one of his abilities so that he can build strength and intelligence for his flop, his 3, and his ultimate. Otherwise, it just hurts any chance of having any fun building damage on Bacchus, which was already bad in Smite 1 and has only gotten significantly worse in Smite 2, even though Hi-Rez wants to give players more freedom to try these different builds in Smite 2. Alright, just before I wrap this video up, I want to give an honorable mention to Fineokay, the video that he made about why beads is unhealthy for Smite, and talk about some of the points that he made and also some of the points that I made in a comment on that video. I've already put a ton of work and time into this video, even though I think I've been very to the point. I don't want to go much longer than I already have, and instead I'll make a video in the near future or in the next alpha playtest to go over some of these further points that I'd also like to see changed in Smite. So let's talk about what he said. This was mostly going over a tweet that he'd made and then kind of iterating on those points. I'm not going to go super in depth. I'm not going to play the video. I just kind of want to basically read these himself and also give him some credit because I think acknowledging things like this is healthy for the game and it doesn't get done enough in Smite. So he said that he thinks beads is inherently anti-playmaking, it's almost exclusively used defensively and has a low skill ceiling compared to something like Blink, and that every argument for it he doesn't like in a new game like Smite 2. Too much CC in the game, you're making a new game, lower the CC in the game, which is something we talked about in this very video. Every character doesn't need 3 hard CCs. This is one of the funniest cause people act like it should just be a given that there's too much CC in the game. They can change it, it's an upcoming new game, right? Beads is too noob friendly. I'd argue it's not really. Most noobs don't even recognize the CC they're being hit by or know when to use it. Combat Blink, for example, is much more intuitive. I would agree with this as well. Beads is something that very often doesn't get used. Even coming back to Smite, I feel like I get a lot of potato beads moments where it's just like, oh, I've been CC'd, I react too late, I'm kind of greedy with it. Whereas as you play the game more and more, you recognize beadsing maybe even before you get hit with a CC or at the very moment that you get hit with a CC. It's also less rewarding for new players. Imagine you finally hit that max range CC ability or get a sick 4-man Ares ult as a new player, and they just beads and walk away. It's disheartening. And that is absolutely true. Beads is anti-playmaking. It's something where it feels like a necessary part of the game because CCs last for so long, as we already talked about earlier in this video. But if you're actually making a new game, you can lower the CC duration so it's not such a problem, remove beads, and add blink. I would prefer blink as the default. That's just me. I'm going off of his tweet here. This is not actually me saying this. Maybe there shouldn't be a default. I think there's some good arguments against blink as well, but at least the game will be more fun with it and think it's easier to counter blink because you'll have your own to chase. So this is something based off of Predecessor. Anybody that has watched me play Predecessor, this is something that I know from hearing him talk about this, that is something where he started playing Predecessor at a similar time. And it's something that's very fun in Pred. It's like a 4 or 5, it's been a few days since I played Pred. 4 or 5 minute cooldown. I think it's a 5-minute cooldown. It's a combat blink. It goes a decently long distance. In Smite, it would go probably a less long distance. And it's something where it's just simply when you need it, as long as it's up, you can use it. And then, of course, because everybody has one, assuming theirs is up, they can also chase you. And it's something you can do to juke an ability, reach a kill you're trying to get, try and dip to tower. And I think it's definitely a much more exciting, active option than beads is. But I think the bigger component of the argument is that beads is such an unhealthy hindrance on the game. And I dove into a lot of the CC stuff that I talked about in this, but also brought up some other points that I did not bring up in this that we'll talk about in the future, like animation times and Smite. So I wrote a giant paragraph of a comment. I was that guy. It got upvoted a shitload. I don't know how much of that is content creator privilege and how much of it's people just agreeing with what I said. But I said that I am pretty content with either beads or with blink, and that IMO the... I can't believe I just said IMO. In my opinion, the other points that Fineokay made are the more important issue for Smite 2, and that I'm pretty worried at this point Hi-Rez is never going to implement those. CC durations need to be way lower, but DR should be removed, and animation should be made way shorter. So like I said in this video, I think CC should be very much nerfed, but DR should be removed. So in a way, CC would not be as effective, but in a way, it would also be more effective. It would generally feel better to use. It would feel better to be CC'd by, to play against, where it's not just, oh, Ymir Freeze does 2 seconds. No, it doesn't. It literally never will. You would need Ymir Freeze and somebody else hitting some sort of ability like that to be CC'd for 2 seconds. That'd feel way better, right? But also, one of the things to go along with that, and this applies to CC abilities and to damage abilities, it varies all over Smite, is that animation should be shorter in the game. It is crazy how many abilities in Smite take a very long time to go off. And one of the most notable examples, Hi-Rez made a change for this, is that Naja 3, Naja Sash, which is a stun that kind of you like hit them with it, you pull yourself to them while they're stunned, was such a long animation to pull yourself to them that with DR that used to apply to it, you could actually hit them, pull yourself to them, they would be unstunned before you get there. You actually would pull yourself into range to just get a shit tier ability that they walk away from. It was ridiculous. And that's because it was a 1 second stun. DR could be crazy. You could potentially get a Naja Sash that was a 0.2 second stun. Now they changed that. They implemented DR immune abilities. I don't remember if that's what they call, I think they call them something else, but basically they implemented a few abilities that no longer have DR apply to them, which was a good change. But I think it's a clear example that overall Smite needs bigger changes where CC durations for the abilities that are lasting too long need to be toned down, and then DR should just be removed entirely. And going along with that, those CCs that don't last all that long but have long animations feel too bad. They need to have shorter animations and potentially slightly longer CC times, but normally the answer is simply shorter animations. And then I went into that a little bit more with some different examples that were just off the top of my head that exist in the game. So right now it takes like 5 seconds to get Mulan's non-ult abilities off because their animations are so long. This is something I'll show you guys like a jungle practice clip. I don't have this recorded. I don't know how long it actually takes. I'm assuming 5 seconds is dramatic, but it's very long. And pretty much anybody that's played Mulan, whether you like her or you don't, I think can agree that it's crazy how long her base kit, I don't mean her ultimate here, takes to get off. Her ultimate takes way too long as well. So really long animations, making it so that especially as you're trying to DPS in the late game, whether you're building damage Mulan, tank Mulan, you get into the state of the game where characters like that, and Mulan being one of the most extreme examples, you're just getting your buttons off, and even if you don't get crowd controlled, you're just getting deleted by people with damage that goes off faster. Agni bombs can just be dumped on you, Andy can dash, Andy can flame wave, and you're still getting off your Mulan abilities even though you don't have 3 ults that you're trying to drop. Like, I'm assuming Agni Bombs plus Core Kit should go off about as fast as Mulan's Core Kit, not including her ult, and that's insane. That's 6 abilities. So, moving on to other stuff that I said, if Hi-Rez is willing to release gods at a slower pace, they could spend the extra time significantly reworking a large chunk of the gods to fit a new game with a new vision. So that's partially touching on stuff that I talked about earlier in this video. That's partially touching on things that I'm not going to go super in depth with, but I thought I would also bring up in this video, which are those animation times, distance of abilities, smaller things that aren't crazy reworks, but would really affect the feel of a god. And then I talked about that more. So a lot of movement abilities need nerfs too. And it's insane to me that as somebody that loves Set is one of my favorite characters in the game. He's been hard nerfed off cooldown. I have basically never cared. I think he's eaten legitimately at least 10 nerfs to like his 2 and his 1. I still think he's cracked. I still make plays with him, even though he should effectively be garbage at this point. So it's insane that me, as somebody that loves him, can teleport on Set behind you from outside of your auto attack range on a non-ultimate ability. That is crazy distance on a movement ability, and there are a lot of movement abilities in Smite like that are very cracked and capable of so much. And that's something where, having played Predecessor now, those are just out of this world. Predecessor has an ability on, he's a boring character, Murdoch, who he has either a 25% or 30% movement speed boost for a few seconds, and that is an insane movement ability in Predecessor. I am not kidding. It is very strong. And the reason it's so strong is because in Predecessor, you don't get slowed as much from auto-attacking, so it effectively gives him not only a speed boost, but haste. And that's really, really powerful. But in Smite, a very strong movement ability is going to be crazy teleport, crazy long dash, and that dash is also going to do a lot of damage, such as Thoth 2, where when amplified, to be fair, by his 3, he can dash incredibly far, longer than auto attack range, then set up what's kind of an extra long auto attack that also does extra damage and roots you. That's insane, right? So movement in Smite is crazy, and I would love to see it if those movement abilities were toned down so they didn't extend to auto attack range, but instead more often reached like about half of that to maybe 3/4 of that, and that movement abilities felt less broken in the game, and the characters without them that frequently suffer, like Zhang Kui and Zeus and all sorts of other characters, felt stronger in comparison. So an example of dashes that I like, or not just dashes, I'm skimming here, I don't have this scripted, I'm just reading off of my comment, but examples of abilities that I like in terms of movement are Herc Dash, Kukulkan Jump, Kama Jump, Merlin Blink, etc. They reach a decent distance, they're powerful as movement abilities, but they're quick, they're clean, and they don't go insanely far. Those abilities are way more satisfying to use because they have those fast animations which match their short distances, while there's other jumps like On Her Jump, Fenrir Jump, Bacchus Flop that sit in the air for like half a second, and that makes it easier to miss. It kind of makes up for the crazy range, but it's less satisfying of an ability because sometimes it's like, get fucked, I just flopped on you from outside of your auto attack range, now you're CC'd, now you're getting punished, and then other times they just simply wiggle out of it because it takes so long for the ability to go off. So maybe I'm just a delusional Smite player, and I still think a third-person MOBA like Smite 2 has the potential to capture a big player base, and has only failed to do so because the characters need to feel better to play, the items need to feel more satisfying to use, and the map needs to feel more interesting. But I have been enjoying Pred way more than Smite lately, and it's because of so many of these things that I want for Smite 2 are already in Pred. And yeah, that kind of sums it up. By the way, for anybody not reading along at this point, because I think I stopped reading for a little bit, that was me finishing the comment, which I still agree with. I think there are a lot of things in Smite that I enjoy more than Pred. However, I think there are a lot of base game components that Pred does a lot better than Smite. I think their items are more fun. I think their animations and their abilities are more reliably quick, clean, and balanced. I think, honestly, one of the only examples of this not being true are probably Argus, who does have an absolutely insane CC chain, kind of randomly thrown on a mage. For the most part, that game feels pretty consistent, where when you have something extreme, it is the extreme part of your kit. It is what you do. It's iconic, and you have other downsides that have larger faults, but that overall your character feels good to play and feels satisfying to do what it does and does not feel clunky. I can't think of any character in the game that actually feels clunky to me. I think the only things that have felt clunky at all are things that just take a little bit of getting used to, and they don't take very long to get used to. Another thing that I want to point out that I don't know at all the details behind is that I think Pred feels way more satisfying to play on ping, even though I would expect it to feel the opposite, because Pred is a lot closer, at least graphically, to a, I guess not first-person shooter, but a third-person shooter, which you would expect to have more of a problem based on ping than Smite does. However, East Coast servers on Pred versus East Coast servers on Smite, I will take Preds any day of the week. The ping mostly stands out for me on last hit range, where I will see things go into the red, which is last hit range, and then from there, I'll click on it while it's in last hit range, and depending on how low it is, it might kind of look like I hit it in last hit range, but the minion dies, and then I don't get last hit credit. It's annoying. It's very rare that I look at myself land an auto or land an ability, and then that doesn't connect. They go off at the same speed, it feels like, as they would on the lower ping West Coast servers for me, but unlike Smite, it ends up actually connecting frequently. I'm not getting ghost hits, and it's so much more satisfying. Don't know the details behind it, don't know how Hi-Rez could fix it, but oh my god, they should look into it. And still, to go along with it to this day, I would love to see, instead of West and East servers for NA, having Central servers actually smacked somewhere near the middle of the United States, so that all of us can connect on decently low ping, because the US is massive, so having servers on one coast that are the dominant server absolutely screws people over on the other coast, and both the West Coast and East Coast of the US have the biggest chunks of this the country's population. So yeah, that really sums things up. I got a lot more freeform towards the end, probably got longer than it should be towards the end because I kind of went off my script and stuff. But those are my current thoughts that I wanted to share on this second alpha playtest. I overall think Smite 2 is just being a follow-up to Smite 1, as I'm expecting Season 1 of Smite 2 to essentially be Season 12 of Smite 1. I am still looking forward to it. But I do think there are a ton of things that Hi-Rez can do to make the game so much better, and I do genuinely expect them not to do it. And I think it's both a mixture of complacency, where I don't think Hi-Rez's developers tend to make as big decisions as they should. I think it's also an issue of them feeling like they need to push this out because they kind of killed Smite 1 a little bit when they released Smite 2, so they need to release Smite 2 as soon as possible, whether it's as good as it could be or not. I think it's going to be too cheap of a version of the game compared to what they could make, and based on a lot of the changes they made so far, I think they're capable of doing a lot more really good things for the game that they're going to be too afraid of committing the time to actually implement in the game, as well as changing some of the game's core systems like crowd control and stuff like that. So those are my expectations. I wish they weren't. I wish they weren't so bleak in a way. At the very least, I'm glad that going forward with Smite 2, I do still expect it to be Smite 1, or better than Smite 1. So yeah, that'll wrap up the video, guys. Thank you all for watching. Hopefully you all did enjoy the video. Feel free to comment based on basically anything that I've said in this video, whether you disagree, agree, whatever. It's always good to hear your feedback. And yeah, if there's things that you said that you think are way too controversial on my part, and it's like, oh my god, I feel the exact opposite, feel free to let me know. But of course, if you actually dead on agree with whether it's one take, all the takes, whatever it may be, definitely let me know as well, because I think for one thing, it's good to try and get a feel for how in touch I am with, at the very least, the people that watch my videos, but also in general with the Smite community and what you guys think about the stuff I said, because I love thinking about stuff like this, but it's not very often that it's worth thinking about stuff like this. I don't work at Hi-Rez. I don't really have a big impact on the game at all. I just get a lot of people watching me that play the game, and so while this is something I very much enjoy, it's not really something that I make money from, so I barely ever end up actually committing time to writing stuff down like this. But thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully you all enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next one.
I've been seeking for the glory. Say my name. And I've been trying to write my own story in the search for fame. I'm sitting here in this empty room, walls keep tumbling down.